Good morning, class. This is Mr. Grainer, and
And Mrs. Bear.
and together we're going to be reading a book for you about the letter O in hippo, which stands for overconsumption. And the book is called She's Wearing a Dead Bird on Her Head by Catherine Lasky.
Harriet Hemingway was a very proper Boston lady. She never talked with her mouth full, but one day she almost did. Standing by the bay window in her parlor, she had just bitten into a jam cookie when her eyes sprang open in dismay. She gasped, leaned forward, swallowed, then turned to her parlor maid. She's wearing a dead bird on her head. Feathers on ladies' hats were becoming more and more popular. At first, hats had been decorated with just feathers, and then designers began to add pairs of wings. But this woman had an entire bird perched atop her hat. Harriet squinted her eyes as the lady of fashion walked proudly by. "Arctic tern, I believe," Harriet whispered. "Looks ready to fly away," said the parlor maid. "It won't," Harriet replied sadly. There's that Arctic tern on her head.
Look at their faces. Harriet felt that she had to do something. Huge populations of birds, from egrets to pheasants to owls to warblers, were being slaughtered for hat decoration. None were spared, not even pigeons. But what could she do? Women in 1896 had very little power. They could not vote, and many had husbands who did not allow them to make decisions for themselves. Some women were not even allowed to read newspapers. Harriet's husband, Augustus, did not treat her this way.
But she and other women like her wanted to change things for all women. She wanted to do something for the birds. Fashion was killing birds as well as killing women's chances to have the right to vote and be listened to. For who would listen to a woman with a dead bird on her head? And if the senseless slaughter for a silly fashion was not stopped, in a few years the birds with the prettiest feathers would all be dead, gone forever, extinct. "I must call Cousin Mina," Harriet said grimly. Look at that cat trying to play with the birds. Is that a sun conure? That's yours?
It looks like it. Click, 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 click. The heels of Miss Mina Hall's high but toned shoes beat a quick rhythm against the bricks of the sidewalk. Her blue eyes were bright as they searched the bare limbs of the trees that lined the avenue for the yellow finches that appeared like spots of flitting gold on this gray winter day. Their quick golden flight swelled her heart. Click, 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 click. She could not be late for tea at Harriet's. This was too important. Click, 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 click. Miss Hall's feet froze in their tracks. Straight ahead there was indeed a pair of golden wings, but they had neither head nor body attached. They were pinned instead to the crown of a lady's hat, and on the brim was a swirl of snowy egret feathers. That's a stink eye.
Revolting! The single word rumbled down Commonwealth Avenue as noisily as a cannonball loose on a ship's deck. "Me?" the fashionable lady squeaked with dismay. You heartless creature, that a bird should be slaughtered just to make you feel pretty? Yuck! Mina made a scalding sound deep in the back of her throat. There's a cat again.
When Mina stormed into the parlor, Harriet was preparing tea. "Well, Harriet," Mina exclaimed as she pulled off her felt cap, "from Arlington Street to Clarendon. 3 egrets, 1 marabou, 2 grebes, 1 golden finch, and—" Mina paused. Her cousin waited nervously, the teacup chattering on the saucer she was holding. "A hummingbird!" "Oh, no, Mina." "Oh, yes, Harriet, perched in full flight on a bunch of silk roses with a veil. Disgusting! Revolting! Nauseating! Vile!" The words flew through the air like red-hot cinders. "Well, let's get down to business," Mina said. "Do you have the book?"
"Yes, right here." Harriet Hemingway walked over to a shelf in the parlor and took down a large blue volume. The words "Boston Social Register" were written across the cover in gold letters. The book was a list of all the grandest families in Boston. They opened the book, and with pencils in hand, they began to scan the list of families, starting with A. Mrs. Appleton, quite fashionable. Indeed, a peafowl with a few warbler feathers at tea last week. Bancroft, marabou fan and hat to match at the opera. Finally, they got to Z. Mrs. Zacharias, egrets and warblers with a touch of flamingo, I do believe. Luncheon at the Somerset Hotel.
Dear, dear, Mina moaned and sipped the last of her tea. What shall we do? Well, Harriet scratched her head. We have garden clubs and history clubs. Why not form a bird club? Not to just watch birds, no, but to protect them and stop this senseless murdering for fashion. What a wonderful idea, said Mina. Let's do it. Let's start a club for the birds. Right then, they began to write letters to all the Boston ladies of fashion who wore the plumage of birds, imploring them to stop, to put aside their fancy hats with swirls of owl feathers, breasts of grebes, wings of hummingbirds, and plumes of egrets, and instead join a society dedicated to protecting all birds. This was the first informal meeting of the Audubon Society, named after a man they admired, John Audubon, the famous painter of birds. Look at all this bird. That one is just sitting on top of her head on the nest. Looks like it's alive.
Harriet and Mina were very persuasive. They convinced women not only that killing birds was wrong, but that the birds as hat decoration made women look silly. Soon, many of the fashionable ladies of Boston to whom they had written letters did join the society.
For the club to accomplish its goals, however, Harriet and Mina knew it also needed men, smart, powerful men who could vote and go into public places like the state legislatures and the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. So they asked lawyers and doctors, sportsmen, and bird experts to join too.
At the second meeting of the Audubon Society, Harriet and Mina and the new members made up rules for their club. I think, said one gentleman, that there should be an exception made for ducks. What kind of exception? Harriet asked. We want to hunt them, replied another gentleman. Rules are rules, fumed Mina. Sportsmen aren't special, another woman said and stamped her foot. The women won. There would be no killing of ducks or game birds. Then all of the members devised a plan to get the word out on birds to everyone, and the Bird Hat campaign of the Audubon Society began in earnest.
They decided to bring their cause to the children of the state of Massachusetts. So into the schools they went, Mina, Harriet, and other members of the society. In Florida, heaps of birds stripped of their feathers are left dying on the ground, Harriet told one class of children, holding up a photograph of a pile of dead egrets. What happened to their babies, the ones left in the nest? A student asked. The ones that are too young to fly are left to die. So you see, we need your help. The birds need your help to protect them against the plume hunters and the hat makers. Please join our club. Soon there were over 10,000 junior members of the Audubon Society in the state of Massachusetts, and Audubon societies were formed in other states. More children joined.
The membership in Boston continued to grow, and the meetings were always lively. The orange groves in Florida this year are suffering because there are too many dead hummingbirds on hats and not enough in the groves eating the pests that spoil the fruit, said Miss Harriet Richards, the secretary of the society. Let's get the farmers on our side. Send out a letter, Mina said.
Do have some more apple pie, Harriet offered, and be happy it's not songbird pie, especially in some places, I'm told. All the members stopped eating and looked at the apple pie on their plates. Ghastly, whispered Mr. William Brewster, and for one awful minute they all imagined songbirds instead of apples in their pies, warblers, nightingales, and robins. I think, said Mina, slowly setting down her plate, we better start getting some laws passed.
In the club, everybody was equal. The men and the women of the society wrote up their ideas together and then sent the gentlemen to talk to legislators in the state house and to members of Congress in Washington, D.C., to press for the passage of laws to save the birds. They were successful. An act was passed in 1903 to protect herons and bitterns, two popular hat birds, from hat makers, forbidding them to sell, display, or possess the feathers. In 1904, there was another victory when a law was passed to protect shore, marsh, and beach birds.
Here you see a couple of the birds that are now extinct. You got the heath hen in the middle. That's the great auk on the left. And Mrs. Bear, you know the one on the right.
Oh, that's my favorite, the dodo bird.
Soon there were laws against hunting birds during their breeding seasons, and then a federal law was passed preventing the importation of feathers from Europe and the tropics for hats. The word about birds had spread all the way to England, where Queen Victoria had announced that she would never again wear a feather for fashion. But Mina and Harriet were still far from happy. What good is a law if it isn't enforced? Mina moaned one day as she stood looking out the window at a woman passing by with a pheasant's wing raking the air above her. You can't arrest the lady for wearing the hat, but you can arrest the supplier of the feather, Harriet said. She tapped her head lightly as if to give a little jostle to her brains. There are rumors about secret feather warehouses, she spoke softly. I think we should make a few inquiries.
So the two ladies, with Harriet's husband Augustus, took the train to New York City, where they were not so well known. They got as gussied up as two Boston ladies who loved birds and hated fashion could manage. They sashayed down Fifth Avenue in fancy dresses and wore elaborate hats with streamers and ribbons, but no feathers. Into the fanciest hat store the two cousins and Augustus Hemingway pranced.
I want to buy my wife and dear cousin each a hat, a feathered hat, Augustus announced. The salesperson began fluttering around the prosperous-looking threesome. What will it be, madams? Egrets or doves? A dear little cloche covered with owl feathers, or this broad-brimmed hat with the Arctic tern? Is it not spectacular on the blue felt, just as if it was plunging into the sea? The two ladies swallowed their disgust and muffled their anger. After all, there were more important things at stake. By the end of the shopping expedition, they alas had to buy 2 hats. But they also had the name of the feather supplier with a warehouse in Baltimore, where millions of dead birds and tons of plumes were stored. With this information, they went directly to the authorities. Good face.
Soon after, on a rainy May day, the cousins sat sipping tea. Harriet had just bitten into a crisp wafer when, like a tidal wave, Augustus burst into the parlor. Ladies! He held a newspaper aloft in his hand. You've won! We what? Said Mina. She and Harriet held their breath. One, dear cousin and dear wife, 26,000 illegal gulfskins destined for hats of fashion were seized last night from the Baltimore warehouse. They have shut it down, taken the skins, and arrested the owner. Augustus paused. His rain-slicked face beamed with pride. This law has been enforced.
Mina looked at her cousin. Harriet, we won! But Harriet said nothing, for Harriet Hemingway never spoke with her mouth full, even when she won.
So here's some of the pictures that we found that just shows the hats with the birds right on top of them. They indeed were entire birds.
Could you imagine wearing something like that today? That was fashion about 100 years ago.
Look, this is several birds gave their lives for this. There's
looks like a couple of ducks and I don't know if that's
several, like whole breasts.
A bird of paradise or something. And the eyes are just weird looking. There's a bird of paradise.
Yeah. Even the feathers, I mean, sometimes you can find feathers now that have fallen on the ground or things like that. But we're not talking about that. These were just thousands and thousands and thousands of animals that were killed just for their feathers.
And imagine putting those on there and then bedazzling them.
There's that. Is that a chicken? I think it's a fancy chicken.
She just looks creepy to me.
There's a half a bird. No, that's a whole bird. It's got 2 wings. The head.
I just don't understand. That was fashion.
It's gross. That one's pretty.
Yeah.
But, yeah, too much.
I don't know what. Is she going to a funeral? Or
I don't
what?
know.
Like,
funeral for the birds.
That one looks like it's actually in the act of preening. Just bizarre.
Yeah. So this book was based on a true story. So I do want to read this author's note for you, especially if you can't see it very well on your screen. Harriet Hemingway, she was born in 1858 and she lived more than 100 years. She died in 1960. And Mina Hall, she was born in 1859 and she lived a very long life as well. She died in 1951. They were real people. All of the other people mentioned by name in this story were also real and members of the Audubon Society. Much of the information on early activities pursued by the Society was gathered by reviewing archival material at the Audubon headquarters in Lincoln, Massachusetts.
All time?
Yeah, go ahead.
At the turn of the 20th century, there were many women like Harriet and Mina who wanted to participate more widely in society. In particular, they wanted the right to vote. Such women were smart enough to realize that if they wished to be taken seriously, having a dead bird perched on their hat would not further their cause. The bird hat protest movement became linked in subtle ways with suffrage, the right of voting. I based elements of my story on ideas presented by Jennifer Price's When Women Were Women, Men Were Men, and Birds Were Hats, which eloquently describes the links between the two movements in this country.
It should be noted that there is no confirmed record of Harriet and Mina ever going into a hat store to buy hats to determine the source of the illegal plume trade. There were stories, however, of their finding out about an illegal warehouse. I took the liberty of imagining how they might have come upon such information. It did not seem plausible to me, given the social conventions of the times, that these two well-born, gentle, but determined women would set out alone to track down the culprits. A more reasonable course of action, I felt, was one in which they might visit a hat store in the company of Harriet's husband and ask some leading questions. All other incidents in the book are based on true events.
Harriet and Mina were not the first people to become involved in bird protection, and the Massachusetts Audubon Society was not the first Audubon Society. It was, however, the first that endured and had impact. It is generally recognized that the Massachusetts organization started by Harriet and Mina was the driving force behind the bird protection movement and the most effective in terms of its impact on legislation and education and of heightening the awareness of the general public to environmental concerns. The society still exists, and aside from working in a broad range of ideas concerning the environment, it has most recently been responsible for reintroducing endangered and threatened populations, including such species as the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle, the loon, and the osprey.
A couple more of these pictures I have. They're a little bit harsh, but it's important to note that even today there are still fur coats being made and fur stoles being made, and even some of the UGG boots do use some types of fleece and fur and things like that for inside the boots. And you just have to be very careful that if you want to be conscious and make those decisions wisely, that you can. Some of the other things that I talk about whenever we're in typical class together is just the way that our food is raised. And what you see here, this is the way that some chickens are raised for meat, and these wouldn't be egg-laying chickens.
Looks like a chicken condo.
Yeah. So the egg-laying chickens, so regular iPad, that is the area that an egg-laying chicken would have to be their own little cell. And then it says at the bottom, 95% of the commercial eggs in the U.S. are derived from caged hens. So whenever you see things that are cage-free hens, it's not perfect, but they do have a little bit more freedom.
Measure that out if you get a chance. That's not a very big area for a bird to spend its entire life.
Yeah.
Sad.
So these birds are here. They can't really lay down comfortably and turn around and things like that. They can, but it's not very comfortable. So they would lay this egg. The egg would roll to the front. If you look on the kind of center left of the picture there, you can see the egg because it's on a slanted kind of grate and it rolls forward. And then that is the feed that's in the front that kind of looks like sand. That's their feed. This is the difference. This is what I said about, cage-free eggs. This is what this looks like. Not exactly the best situation here either. So they're not in cages, but then they can also be pecked by their other, cage mates, things like that. Just because they're cage-free, it doesn't necessarily mean they have big access to being outside.
Imagine, I wonder how many birds are actually in that.
You don't want to
Building
know.
a warehouse.
You don't want to know. So these long white buildings are where those chickens would be kept. There's plenty of room that those chickens could be outside. This is a very idyllic little situation, but obviously not very idyllic for the birds. So even though this book was about birds being on hats, there are still other things that we can do to make more wise choices in our everyday lives. You want to add anything?
Yeah, again, this is Mr. Grainer and
Mrs. Bear.
And we thank you for listening to our talk and our presentation about the book. She's wearing a dead bird on her head. Hope you enjoyed.
See you guys.
See ya.
No.